The history of port scanning is intimately tied to the development of computer networking and the Internet. To understand its evolution, we need to step back into the early days of networking, where computers were first being connected together to share data over distances. This period was marked by rapid advancements in computing, networking protocols, and the rise of security concerns as the Internet began to take shape. In the early 1960s, the first experimental networks began to form, paving the way for what would eventually become the modern Internet. The precursor to the Internet was ARPANET, a project developed by the United States Department of Defense's DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, to explore the potential for linking computers in a secure, decentralized manner. The first successful transmission between computers took place in 1969, connecting 4 university research centers across the United States. This was the start of what we now call the Internet, though it was much smaller in scope at the time. ARPANET used the Network Control Protocol, NCP, to facilitate communication between machines, and later adopted TCP, IP, Transmission Control Protocol, Internet Protocol. In the early 1980s, TCP IP was designed to standardize how data could be transmitted across a diverse range of networks, and its adoption laid the groundwork for the global Internet that would emerge in the 1990s. During the formative years of ARPANET, security was not a major concern. The networks were small, relatively isolated, and controlled by trusted institutions. However, as ARPANET began to grow, concerns about privacy and unauthorized access began to emerge. The idea of a port in networking, an endpoint for communication between computers, was an early consideration, but the significance of ports in terms of security was not fully understood. A port is essentially a communication endpoint used by a service to send and receive data. In TCP, IP networking, ports are identified by numbers, with different numbers corresponding to different services. For example, HTTP traffic typically uses port 80, while secure HTTP traffic, HTTPS, uses port 443. In the early days of the Internet, ports were open by default to facilitate communication. This lack of awareness about port security left systems vulnerable to unauthorized access, leading to the emergence of tools designed to identify and probe open ports. Port scanning, as a concept, can be traced back to this period. While the term port scanning did not exist at the time, the practice of scanning for open ports began as a way to discover which services were accessible on a network machine. Early port scanning involved manually inspecting the status of ports on remote machines, usually with limited tools and often as part of a broader effort to understand a system's security. As ARPANET and early Internet systems grew, the need for better tools to probe open ports became more apparent. The idea of scanning ports, while initially rudimentary, eventually laid the foundation for what would become a key part of the security landscape, discovering vulnerabilities through the identification of open ports and the services that run on them. As the 1990s progressed, the Internet exploded in size and complexity, leading to an increase in both the necessity for and the availability of port scanning tools. With the growing number of networked computers, security concerns began to rise sharply. Systems were increasingly interconnected, and new vulnerabilities were being discovered at a rapid pace. The Internet, which had once been a small network of trusted academic and military institutions, had transformed into a vast and chaotic space filled with thousands of publicly accessible machines. This new reality created both opportunities and risks. As the number of open ports increased, so did the need for automated tools that could quickly assess the security of systems across vast networks. Manual port checking had become impractical, especially with the rise of large-scale networks and the burgeoning world of cybercrime. The tools that emerged during this time would become the foundation of modern port scanning. Port scanning tools essentially allowed administrators and attackers to identify open ports and the services running on them, helping them understand the security posture of a system. For administrators, these tools were vital for assessing their networks for vulnerabilities that might be exploited by malicious actors. For hackers, port scanning became a crucial method for identifying targets to exploit. One of the most important milestones in the history of port scanning tools was the development of Nmap, Network Mapper. Nmap was created by Gordon Leone, also known as Fyodor, and released in 1997. It quickly became the most widely used open-source network scanning tool, both for security auditing and for attackers probing systems for vulnerabilities. Nmap revolutionized the process of port scanning by offering several advanced features, such as the ability to perform SYN scans, stealth scanning, and OS detection. These features were instrumental in both identifying open ports and mapping out the network landscape. Nmap could send various types of probes to a system, analyze the responses, and then infer information about the operating system and the services that were running on the target machine. SYN scans, in particular, became one of Nmap's most powerful features. A SYN scan works by sending a SYN packet to a target port, as if initiating a connection, but without completing the handshake. If the target port is open, it responds with a SYN ACK message, indicating it is willing to accept a connection. If the port is closed, the system sends a RST message instead. The SYN scan, which is sometimes called a half-open scan, became widely used because it was fast, efficient, and relatively difficult to detect compared to a full TCP handshake. Stealth scanning techniques also gained prominence in the 1990s as the internet became a more hostile environment. These techniques allowed attackers to bypass traditional security mechanisms and avoid detection by network monitoring systems. Stealth scanning involves sending probes in a way that minimized the likelihood of triggering alerts, which made it harder for network administrators to notice an attack in progress. Nmap and other tools like Angry IP Scanner and Netcat were used to carry out these techniques, helping hackers gather intelligence on target systems while keeping a low profile. While Nmap was a major breakthrough, the 1990s saw the development of several other port scanning tools and techniques. For example, Unicorn Scan and Scanrand emerged as alternatives to Nmap, offering additional scanning capabilities or optimizations for speed. Some tools focused on specific vulnerabilities, such as the Targa scanner, which was designed to exploit weak FTP implementations, or the War Dialer, which was used to scan phone lines for modems. These tools catered to specific needs within the security community, and many were utilized by both security professionals and attackers alike. The rapid proliferation of port scanning tools during the 1990s coincided with an increasing awareness of the vulnerabilities that existed in the ever-growing internet infrastructure. As more individuals and companies connected to the web, the risks associated with open ports became clearer. Common vulnerabilities, such as those in Telnet and FTP services, were regularly targeted by port scanners to identify weak points in the system. This shift toward understanding and exploiting open ports was a reflection of the changing landscape of the internet, which now involved not just trusted academic institutions, but also private companies, government organizations, and cybercriminals. The increasing sophistication of scanning tools also led to a deeper understanding of the TCP, IP stack and how different ports interacted with the protocols running on top of them. Tools like Nmap didn't just identify open ports, they also mapped out the structure of the entire network. By scanning multiple machines and combining the results, administrators and attackers could gain a comprehensive understanding of a network's topology, allowing them to plan more effective attacks or fortify defenses. During the 1990s, port scanning tools played an integral role in the early stages of the security community's efforts to understand and defend against cyber threats. While they were still often seen as tools for hackers and cybercriminals, they began to gain legitimacy as penetration testing tools used by security professionals to identify vulnerabilities in secure systems. As a result, ethical hacking emerged as a profession during this time, with penetration testers using tools like Nmap to scan for open ports and assess the security of networks. The evolution of port scanning in the 1990s marked a turning point in both the offensive and defensive sides of cybersecurity. The rise of powerful scanning tools like Nmap allowed attackers to gain unprecedented access to networks, but they also allowed defenders to fight back by identifying vulnerabilities before they could be exploited. This tug of war between attackers and defenders would continue to shape the development of port scanning tools and techniques in the years to come. As the 1990s progressed, port scanning techniques became more sophisticated, driven by the growing need for both attackers and defenders to better understand the vulnerabilities in network systems. The sheer volume of open ports and services exposed by the rapid expansion of the Internet called for new, more effective methods to identify these open ports without detection. This period saw the refinement of scanning techniques, including the development of SYN scans, ACK scans, and other stealth methods. A SYN scan is one of the most commonly used types of port scanning due to its speed and stealth. As mentioned earlier, the SYN scan works by sending a SYN packet to a target port, as if initiating a connection, but never completing the TCP handshake. If the target port is open, the system responds with a SYN ACK packet, signaling that it is willing to establish a connection. The scanning system then drops the connection before it is fully established, leaving the target system unaware that a scan was conducted. The SYN scan is considered a form of half-open scanning because it does not complete the TCP three-way handshake, which makes it less detectable by the target system's security mechanisms. This technique was a breakthrough because it allowed attackers to scan large networks of computers quickly without triggering alarms. Firewalls and intrusion detection systems, IDS, were not initially designed to detect these types of scans, as they would only look for fully established connections. As a result, attackers could explore an entire network of machines and find open ports without being flagged. In the mid-1990s, the ACK scan emerged as another stealth technique used to bypass network defenses. An ACK scan works by sending an ACK packet to a target port, typically in an attempt to disrupt the state of a firewall or filter. Instead of sending packets to a target to establish a connection, the ACK packet is designed to manipulate the target system's response behavior in unexpected ways. The results of an ACK scan depend on how the target system is configured to handle the response. If the system is behind a firewall or network filter, an open port might respond with a reset RST packet, while closed ports may return a port unreachable message or simply no response. While SYN scans were effective against certain types of firewalls and IDS systems, ACK scans were particularly useful for discovering firewalls and identifying whether a system was behind a filtering mechanism. These scans worked by probing the network for inconsistencies in how firewalls responded to ACK packets, giving attackers insight into the topology of a network and the potential presence of security devices. As firewalls and intrusion detection systems evolved to detect SYN and ACK scans, new scanning techniques were developed to evade these systems. Stealth scanning, which could be used in combination with SYN and ACK scans, became more common. A stealth scan generally refers to any scan designed to minimize the chance of detection by monitoring systems. This could involve techniques like fragmenting packets, which breaks up the scan into smaller, less noticeable parts, or using decoy scanning, which hides the true origin of the scan by sending packets from multiple false sources. These methods made it more difficult for defenders to pinpoint the source of a scan, allowing attackers to perform reconnaissance with greater anonymity. One of the most famous stealth scanning techniques was idle scanning, which allowed attackers to perform a port scan without sending any traffic directly to the target machine. Instead, the attacker would send packets to an intermediary machine, which would forward the response back to the target. This indirect approach made it extremely difficult for network administrators to trace the scan's origin. Though less commonly used, idle scanning was a testament to the ingenuity of attackers looking for ways to bypass increasingly sophisticated defense mechanisms. These scanning techniques were not limited to attackers. Security professionals and penetration testers adopted the same methods to assess networks for vulnerabilities. Penetration testing, or ethical hacking, became a professional field during this period. And tools like Nmap, HPing, and Netcat were used by security experts to conduct authorized port scans and vulnerability assessments. In fact, Ethical hackers were often the first to discover how to bypass IDs and firewalls using SYN, ACK, and stealth scanning techniques. As a result, many of these methods were included in training programs for network security professionals who needed to understand how attackers could exploit weaknesses in their defenses. The development of these scanning techniques during the 1990s marked a significant shift in how cybersecurity was approached. On the one hand, attackers gained new ways to probe networks and find vulnerabilities. On the other hand, defenders were forced to adapt and develop more advanced methods of detecting and preventing these types of scans. This arms race between attackers and defenders has continued to shape the evolution of both offensive and defensive cybersecurity practices. As port scanning techniques became more sophisticated, so too did their application in the broader context of cybersecurity. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, port scanning had evolved into a dual-purpose tool. It was used both by security professionals as part of penetration testing and by malicious actors seeking to exploit vulnerabilities. This dual nature of port scanning has been a central theme throughout its history, and its evolution reflected the broader changes in the cybersecurity landscape. Initially, port scanning tools like Nmap, SuperScan, and Angry IP Scanner were primarily used by administrators and security professionals to audit and secure their networks. During this period, ethical hacking was emerging as a formalized field, with individuals or teams tasked with simulating cyber attacks to test the strength of an organization's defenses. Ethical hackers and penetration testers used port scanning as part of their toolkits to identify vulnerabilities in target systems and networks. These professionals would perform white hat activities, identifying weaknesses in network infrastructure, misconfigured services, and outdated software. By identifying open ports and services that could potentially be exploited, ethical hackers helped organizations patch security holes before they could be used by malicious actors. Port scanning thus became a cornerstone of proactive cybersecurity. However, as the internet grew and cybercrime became more organized, attackers began to exploit port scanning for malicious purposes. Cybercriminals saw port scanning as a way to discover unsecured systems and expose vulnerabilities that could be exploited for financial gain, espionage, or disruption. Attackers would use port scans to probe for common vulnerabilities in services such as FTP, Telnet, and email servers, targeting systems that were misconfigured or had weak passwords. These systems, often left exposed with open ports, became prime targets for compromise. Port scanning also played a significant role in the early days of distributed denial of service (DDoS) attacks. DDoS attacks were used to overwhelm target systems by flooding them with large amounts of traffic, often originating from a network of compromised machines. Scanning for open ports, particularly on web servers, mail servers, and DNS servers, became a critical step in identifying high-value targets that could be used in such attacks. The widespread availability of automated scanning tools further amplified the potential for criminal misuse. As the internet became more accessible, even individuals with limited technical knowledge could carry out port scans and exploit open ports for malicious purposes. Tools like Metasploit and Nessus allowed attackers to automate the process of scanning for and exploiting vulnerabilities, lowering the bar for entry in cybercrime. With the ability to scan entire ranges of IP addresses for open ports, attackers could quickly identify systems to exploit, making port scanning an integral part of cybercriminal operations. At the same time, the rise of organized cybercrime groups led to a new era of cyber warfare and hacktivism. Hackers working for nation-states or politically motivated groups often used port scanning as part of broader cyber espionage operations. By scanning for open ports on critical infrastructure, these actors could gain access to sensitive information or disrupt the operations of governments, corporations, and critical sectors like energy, finance, and telecommunications. While port scanning was once seen primarily as a reconnaissance tool for ethical hackers, it had become a core component of cybercriminal tactics. The ability to identify and exploit open ports was crucial in launching attacks ranging from data theft to system hijacking and service disruption. This shift in how port scanning was used underscored the changing nature of cybersecurity and the growing need for robust defenses to prevent unauthorized access to sensitive systems. Throughout the history of port scanning, there have been several high-profile cybersecurity breaches linked to open ports. These incidents have highlighted the dangers posed by unsecured ports and the consequences of leaving systems exposed to the internet without adequate protection. As the internet evolved, so too did the tactics used by attackers to exploit vulnerabilities, and open ports have consistently been a weak point that could be exploited in a variety of ways. One of the most significant examples of a breach linked to open ports occurred in the early 2000s with the Slammer worm, also known as SQL Slammer. This worm exploited a vulnerability in Microsoft SQL Server 2000, which was caused by a flaw in how the server handled specially crafted packets. The worm spread rapidly, infecting thousands of systems within minutes, and it was able to propagate through open ports on vulnerable SQL servers. SQL Slammer was able to exploit the vulnerability by sending malicious packets to port 1434, the default port for SQL Server. Once infected, systems could not only be compromised but also used to launch denial of service (DOS) attacks against other systems, disrupting internet traffic worldwide. Another major incident linked to open ports occurred during the Heartbleed vulnerability outbreak in 2014. Heartbleed was a flaw in the OpenSSL cryptographic library, which is used by a large number of internet services to secure data communications. The vulnerability was tied to port 443, the default port for HTTPS traffic. Heartbleed allowed attackers to exploit the heartbeat extension of OpenSSL, potentially gaining access to sensitive information, such as passwords, private keys, and other encrypted data, by sending specially crafted packets to servers. The flaw existed in the OpenSSL code for over 2 years before it was discovered and patched, making it a prime example of how open ports and weak security protocols can lead to devastating breaches. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the security landscape was dramatically changing. As the internet grew and organizations became increasingly reliant on digital infrastructure, the need for consistent and reliable methods of auditing and securing network systems became paramount. With the rise of new port scanning tools and techniques, network administrators began to recognize the critical importance of regularly assessing their systems for open ports and services that could be vulnerable to attacks. Automated port scanning emerged as a crucial component of network security audits, allowing administrators to assess the state of their systems without having to manually inspect every open port. Network security audits typically involve reviewing a company's entire network for potential vulnerabilities. Port scanning plays a key role in this process by enabling administrators to identify which ports are open and which services are running on those ports. By mapping out the network and understanding which ports are open, organizations can determine whether they are running any outdated or vulnerable services that could be exploited by attackers. For example, the use of FTP, File Transfer Protocol, which was once common for file sharing, became increasingly risky as vulnerabilities were discovered that could be exploited through open FTP ports. Automated port scanning tools, such as Nmap, Nessus, and Qualys Guard, became essential for performing regular security audits. These tools could quickly scan an entire network, identifying open ports and assessing whether the services running on those ports were up to date and properly configured. In particular, Nmap's ability to detect services and versions running on specific ports helped security professionals identify outdated services and misconfigurations, which could pose a serious risk. When combined with other vulnerability scanners, administrators could create a comprehensive map of their network's security posture. During the early 2000s, penetration testing and vulnerability assessments became more common within organizations, with companies hiring ethical hackers to perform comprehensive security audits. These tests would often begin with a thorough port scan, followed by detailed analysis of the results. The idea was to assess which ports were exposed to the internet and whether those ports were running services that could potentially be used as entry points for malicious actors. If a vulnerability was discovered, ethical hackers would report it to the organization, along with recommendations for mitigation, such as patching software, configuring firewalls, or disabling unnecessary services. The growing sophistication of network security tools and techniques led to increased awareness of security practices within organizations. Many companies began to recognize that network perimeter defenses, such as firewalls and intrusion detection systems, were not enough on their own to protect against the ever-evolving threat landscape. Network segmentation and segmentation of services running on different ports became a key strategy for reducing risk. By only exposing necessary ports to the public internet, companies could limit the surface area of potential attacks and make it harder for hackers to exploit vulnerabilities. While automated port scanning played a critical role in identifying vulnerabilities, it also presented challenges for organizations. The sheer volume of open ports across large, complex networks made it difficult to track and maintain a comprehensive inventory of exposed services. Additionally, as port scanning tools became more advanced, attackers began to use them to conduct reconnaissance and exploit open ports for various malicious purposes, such as launching DDoS attacks or stealing data. This dynamic created a security arms race. Network defenders continuously improved their scanning tools and practices to identify vulnerabilities, while attackers refined their techniques to avoid detection and exploit open ports for illicit activities. As a result, security professionals and organizations found themselves constantly adapting to new challenges. Whether it was the rise of sophisticated malware or the increasing use of automated attacks targeting open ports, the role of port scanning continued to evolve as cyber threats became more complex and sophisticated. As cybercriminals developed new techniques for automating attacks and scaling their efforts, port scanning increasingly became part of larger automated campaigns targeting vulnerable systems across the globe. The development of botnets, networks of compromised devices controlled by malicious actors, represented a major shift in how port scanning and exploitation were carried out. Botnets have become one of the most prominent and impactful aspects of modern cyber threats. A botnet is essentially a network of infected computers or devices that are under the control of a cybercriminal, often without the knowledge of the device owners. These compromised devices can be used to launch large-scale attacks, such as DDoS, distributed denial of service, attacks, spamming campaigns, and more. Port scanning is a key tool used by botnets to identify vulnerable devices that can be hijacked and added to the network. In the early days of botnets, the scanning of open ports was done manually by attackers. However, as botnet operators refined their techniques, port scanning became an automated part of the botnet's operations. Once a botnet had infected a device, it could automatically scan other devices on the network for open ports, searching for vulnerable services that could be exploited. For example, many botnets have been designed to specifically target IoT, Internet of Things, devices, which are often left unsecured with open ports exposed to the Internet. These IoT devices, such as webcams, routers, and home automation systems, have become prime targets for port scans because they are often poorly configured and lack basic security features like strong passwords or firmware updates. One of the most infamous botnets associated with open port scanning was the Mirai botnet, which was responsible for one of the largest DDoS attacks ever recorded in 2016. The Mirai botnet was primarily composed of IoT devices that had been infected by scanning for open telnet ports, port 23. The botnet would scan the internet for devices with weaker default passwords for the telnet service and attempt to gain access to those devices. Once a device was compromised, it would be added to the botnet and used to launch massive DDoS attacks on targeted websites. The Mirai botnet demonstrated the power of automated port scanning and the threat posed by unsecured open ports on IoT devices. The Mirai attack was a turning point in the cybersecurity world because it highlighted the risks associated with the widespread deployment of internet-connected devices. As more and more devices become part of the IoT ecosystem, the number of open ports exposed to the internet increases, creating more opportunities for attackers to exploit vulnerabilities. The success of Mirai and other similar botnets underscored the need for organizations and individuals to secure their devices by closing unused ports, changing default passwords, and updating firmware regularly. The use of automated botnets for port scanning and exploitation represents a shift in the landscape of cyber threats. Traditional cyber attacks were often carried out by individual hackers or small groups, manually scanning and exploiting vulnerable systems. Today, however, botnets enable attackers to scan entire blocks of IP addresses at a much higher speed and scale than ever before. This makes it more difficult for security professionals to keep up with the sheer volume of attacks and scan attempts being made on a daily basis. To combat these automated threats, security teams have increasingly relied on advanced tools that can detect and block port scanning attempts in real time. Intrusion detection systems, IDS, firewalls, and rate-limiting technologies have been deployed to identify and block port scanning activities before they can lead to serious compromises. Additionally, behavioral analysis and anomaly detection techniques have been developed to identify unusual patterns of network traffic that may indicate a port scan in progress. As the Internet continues to grow, and as more devices are connected to it, the challenge of securing open ports becomes even more critical. Automated attacks using port scanning are likely to remain a major concern for the cybersecurity community, requiring constant vigilance and adaptation to new threats and technologies. As we move further into the 21st century, the role of port scanning in cybersecurity continues to evolve in response to new technologies, emerging threats, and changing regulations. The rise of cloud computing, the growing reliance on mobile devices, and the explosion of IoT devices have all introduced new challenges for network administrators and security professionals. These changes, combined with the continued sophistication of attackers, mean that port scanning will remain a critical aspect of network security for the foreseeable future. Cloud computing has brought about significant changes to how networks are designed and managed. Traditionally, port scanning was a way to assess physical systems within an organization's network perimeter. With the advent of cloud environments, however, organizations now rely on a distributed infrastructure that spans multiple physical locations, making it more difficult to perform traditional port scans. Cloud providers often use virtual private clouds, VPCs, and other segmentation techniques to isolate different parts of the network, making it harder for attackers to perform broad scans of entire infrastructures. Furthermore, the growing use of encryption is changing the landscape of port scanning. Many services are now encrypted, making it more difficult to identify open ports and determine which services are running on them. For instance, services running on HTTPS, port 443, are encrypted using SSL, TLS, which prevents port scanners from easily identifying the contents of the communication. While port scanners can still detect open ports, the encrypted traffic makes it much harder to assess the vulnerability of the services running on those ports. As the number of devices connected to the Internet continues to grow, so too will the challenges posed by port scanning. New types of attacks will emerge, and attackers will continually refine their port scanning techniques to stay ahead of detection systems. The future of port scanning will likely involve more sophisticated tools and methods, such as artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning, ML. As the world of cybersecurity continues to evolve, the application of artificial intelligence, AI, in the realm of port scanning is beginning to gain traction. Traditional port scanning techniques, while effective, have limitations in terms of scalability and the ability to detect sophisticated or low-profile attacks. As a result, organizations are increasingly turning to AI and machine learning, ML, to enhance their capabilities in identifying open ports, analyzing network traffic, and preventing unauthorized access. AI's role in port scanning is an important development because it leverages the massive amount of data generated by network interactions and applies intelligent algorithms to better understand patterns, predict risks, and mitigate vulnerabilities. In the context of port scanning, AI can be employed to analyze historical data and improve the accuracy of scans. For example, AI can help distinguish between legitimate traffic and potentially malicious scanning activity. AI models can learn the usual patterns of legitimate traffic on a network and use that knowledge to flag any unusual or anomalous behavior. such as scans across a broad range of ports, which could be indicative of a cyber attack. The efficiency of a port scan is vital in large enterprise environments where network infrastructures can be massive, and scanning every device manually or with traditional methods can be prohibitively time-consuming. AI-powered scanners can learn to perform adaptive scans, which target only the most relevant ports based on a network's evolving conditions. These scans can adjust their intensity and focus depending on the time of day, the network load, or the current threat level. Furthermore, AI can assist in the classification of network services running on specific ports. Traditionally, identifying which service is running on a given port involves a technique called banner grabbing, where the scanner tries to elicit a response from a service running on an open port to identify its version or type. However, this method can sometimes be evasive or ineffective against certain services that hide their identity or try to obscure themselves from port scans. With AI, however, there is the potential for more advanced pattern recognition to decode services running on ports based on subtle indicators or behavior, without having to rely solely on the banner grabbing technique. However, the incorporation of AI into port scanning doesn't come without its challenges. One major issue is the ethics of AI-driven scanning. Given that AI-powered tools can scan networks far more efficiently and thoroughly than traditional methods, there is the potential for this technology to be misused by malicious actors. In the wrong hands, AI could be used to automate not just the scanning of open ports but also to identify and exploit weaknesses in those systems. This raises questions about security policy and regulations around the use of AI for penetration testing, ethical hacking, and vulnerability assessments. As AI becomes more involved in cybersecurity, the ethical lines between legitimate security practices and malicious activities may become increasingly blurred. To address these issues, many cybersecurity experts advocate for the implementation of security frameworks and policies that ensure AI-driven port scanning and analysis are used responsibly. By establishing guidelines and monitoring usage, organizations can ensure that AI is applied to improve network security and defend against threats, rather than being used as a tool for harm. Proper oversight and transparency are essential to ensuring that AI remains a force for good in the cybersecurity landscape. In the coming years, AI's role in port scanning is expected to continue expanding. As networks grow more complex, AI-driven tools will become even more integral in identifying vulnerabilities and responding to threats in real time. Furthermore, the advancement of deep learning models, which can simulate human-like cognitive abilities, may enhance the accuracy and effectiveness of port scans, ultimately enabling cybersecurity professionals to stay one step ahead of increasingly sophisticated cybercriminals. Port scanning, while an essential tool for maintaining the security of networks, often exists in a gray area when it comes to legal and ethical considerations. This is particularly true for unauthorized port scanning, where individuals or entities conduct scans on networks without the explicit consent of the owner. Although port scanning itself is not inherently malicious, it can be perceived as a prelude to an attack, especially if the purpose is to identify vulnerabilities for later exploitation. As such, laws and regulations surrounding port scanning vary significantly by jurisdiction, and understanding these legal boundaries is critical for both ethical hackers and security professionals. In many countries, unauthorized port scanning is considered a form of cyber intrusion or cyber surveillance. In the United States, for example, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFAA, criminalizes certain forms of unauthorized access to computer systems. While the law doesn't specifically outlaw port scanning, it does prohibit any unauthorized access or activities that may lead to unauthorized access, including scanning for vulnerabilities. This means that if someone scans a network without permission and uses that scan to exploit vulnerabilities or gain unauthorized access, they could face legal consequences under the CFAA. One of the primary concerns with port scanning is that it can be used as a reconnaissance technique for cybercriminals. For example, attackers often use port scanning to identify open ports on a target network and gather information about potential vulnerabilities in a system. This information gathering is crucial for launching cyber attacks. For this reason, even if the scan itself is non-invasive, it can be treated as a precursor to illegal activities. Unauthorized port scanning is often seen as a method of preparation for future attacks, making it a suspicious activity in many eyes. Ethical concerns also arise when it comes to scanning third-party networks. For example, some security researchers may conduct port scans as part of their work, either for penetration testing or as part of a broader security audit. However, if these scans are done without proper authorization, even with the intention of identifying vulnerabilities and improving security, they can still be viewed as invasive. To avoid potential legal trouble, security professionals must ensure that they have clear consent before scanning a network. Ethical hackers, in particular, are required to follow strict guidelines and obtain written permission before performing any port scans as part of their work. The rise of hacking groups and cybercrime organizations that use port scanning for malicious purposes has further complicated the legal landscape surrounding this practice. These groups often conduct wide-scale scans of the internet in search of exposed ports, which can then be exploited for ransomware attacks, data breaches, or the installation of malicious software. In these cases, the intent behind the scan is clearly malicious, and legal action is taken against those responsible. The difficulty, however, lies in tracking and prosecuting individuals involved in such activities, especially when they operate anonymously through networks like the dark web or use proxy servers to obscure their identity. In response to the growing problem of unauthorized port scanning and cybercrime, some countries have introduced laws specifically targeting cybersecurity practices and vulnerability disclosure. These laws help ensure that ethical hackers can conduct their work legally and responsibly, without fear of legal repercussions. For instance, in 2016, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, introduced strict requirements for companies to secure their networks and data. While GDPR does not directly regulate port scanning, it encourages organizations to take proactive steps in identifying vulnerabilities, including regular vulnerability scanning, which could involve port scanning. As cybersecurity continues to evolve, international collaboration will be necessary to establish clear guidelines on how port scanning should be handled, ensuring that it remains a useful tool for improving network security without causing legal or ethical complications. The future of port scanning in an increasingly connected world looks both challenging and transformative. As the internet grows and new technologies such as 5G, IoT, and blockchain become more prevalent, the security implications of exposed ports will become more significant. Port scanning will continue to be a crucial tool in securing networks, but the way it is used, and the technologies behind it, will evolve as cybersecurity practices adapt to a rapidly changing digital landscape. One of the major factors influencing the future of port scanning is the rapid expansion of the Internet of Things, IoT. With billions of devices coming online, many of them with limited security features, the number of open ports exposed to the Internet will continue to increase. IoT devices are often designed to be easy to set up and use, but they often lack the strong security measures found in traditional computing devices. As a result, many IoT devices are vulnerable to exploitation via port scanning. It is likely that automated port scanning tools will continue to play a major role in identifying vulnerable IoT devices, helping security professionals identify and mitigate risks before they can be exploited. The rise of 5G networks will also impact the way port scanning is conducted. The faster, more reliable speeds offered by 5G will enable larger-scale scans and create new opportunities for attackers to explore networks in real time. As 5G infrastructure continues to be rolled out globally, it will be essential for cybersecurity experts to adapt their scanning techniques to identify vulnerabilities in these high-speed environments. The ability to scan vast numbers of devices at once, without impacting performance, will be a key challenge that security professionals must address in the coming years. Finally, blockchain technology could bring both new opportunities and challenges for port scanning. Blockchain, known for its decentralized nature, has the potential to introduce new ways of securing networks and digital identities, which may make port scanning more difficult or less effective in certain contexts. However, the need for robust cybersecurity measures in blockchain networks will likely keep port scanning relevant, as even decentralized systems will need to be continuously monitored for vulnerabilities. As cybersecurity threats continue to evolve, organizations have turned to vulnerability assessments to protect their systems and networks. Port scanning plays an important role in this process by helping to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited by attackers. Vulnerability assessments typically involve scanning a network for open ports, services running on those ports, and any weaknesses or misconfigurations in those services that could be exploited. This combination of port scanning and vulnerability assessment allows security professionals to identify critical risks and address them before an attacker can exploit them. The importance of port scanning and vulnerability assessments cannot be overstated. Port scans provide a first line of defense by revealing which ports are open and which services are accessible from outside the network. This basic knowledge is crucial for understanding the exposure of a system and whether it could be targeted by attackers. Once a port scan has been completed, the next step is to perform a deeper analysis of the services running on those open ports. Tools like Nmap and Nessus can help assess the security posture of the services and identify known vulnerabilities, such as outdated software versions or insecure configurations, that may leave the system open to attack. In recent years, vulnerability assessments have become more sophisticated, with advanced scanning techniques and tools that go beyond simple port scanning. Modern vulnerability assessment tools now include features like credentialed scans, which provide more detailed insights by authenticating to systems and scanning them with higher privileges. These scans are able to identify vulnerabilities that might not be visible through standard and authenticated port scans, such as those found in restricted system files or configurations. However, even with these advanced capabilities, the foundation of any vulnerability assessment still relies on the accurate identification of open ports through port scanning. The process of vulnerability assessment has become more automated with the advent of security automation tools. These tools leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning to scan networks more efficiently and accurately, helping organizations quickly identify vulnerabilities in real time. The integration of port scanning into these automated systems allows for more dynamic vulnerability assessments that adapt to changing network environments and continuously monitor for new threats. The growth of the cloud computing environment has also introduced new challenges and opportunities for vulnerability assessments. In cloud-based infrastructures, traditional methods of port scanning can be less effective because of the distributed and often dynamic nature of cloud services. Cloud services like Amazon Web Services, AWS, and Microsoft Azure offer scalable solutions where the IP addresses and ports of resources can change frequently, making it harder to pinpoint open ports and services. To address these challenges, cloud security providers have developed new vulnerability scanning tools that integrate with their infrastructure, offering better ways to scan for vulnerabilities and perform port scans across large-scale cloud environments. These tools often combine automated port scanning with advanced vulnerability detection techniques to provide a more complete security picture for organizations running cloud-based applications and services. With the increasing complexity of modern networks and cloud environments, vulnerability assessments are becoming more critical than ever. As cyber attacks become more sophisticated and the attack surface continues to grow, organizations must regularly assess the security of their networks and systems, using tools like port scanners to identify and mitigate risks before they are exploited by malicious actors. The practice of ethical hacking and penetration testing plays a central role in identifying vulnerabilities in a network and securing it against attacks. Port scanning is a key component of these practices, as it allows ethical hackers to gather information about a system's exposure to the internet and identify weak points that could be exploited. Ethical hackers use port scanning techniques to simulate attacks and find vulnerabilities, which they can then report to the organization to help them strengthen their defenses. Penetration testing is an authorized and controlled form of ethical hacking where security professionals attempt to exploit vulnerabilities in a system or network to test its defenses. During a penetration test, Port scanning is one of the first steps used to identify open ports and assess the security of services running on those ports. By identifying potential entry points, ethical hackers can focus their efforts on probing those services for vulnerabilities that could allow them to gain unauthorized access or compromise the system. Penetration testing typically follows a set of phases: reconnaissance, scanning, exploitation, and reporting. The scanning phase relies heavily on port scanning, which helps ethical hackers identify the open ports and services they can target. Once the ports are discovered, the ethical hacker will perform more detailed analysis to look for weaknesses in the services running on those ports, such as outdated software, weak authentication mechanisms, or misconfigured settings. One of the main benefits of using port scanning in ethical hacking and penetration testing is that it provides a non-invasive method of assessing network security. Port scans do not cause any direct damage to the system and can be performed remotely, making them a safe way to identify potential vulnerabilities. However, the impact of a port scan can vary depending on the context. While a simple scan may not trigger an alarm, large-scale or aggressive scanning may be detected by intrusion detection systems, IDS, or intrusion prevention systems, IPS, which could lead to false positives or alerts. This is why ethical hackers must work closely with the organization being tested to ensure that their activities do not disrupt normal operations or trigger unnecessary alerts. Penetration testing is a valuable tool for organizations seeking to improve their cybersecurity posture. By leveraging port scanning and other techniques, ethical hackers can provide insight into potential vulnerabilities and recommend remediation steps to mitigate risks. The results of penetration testing can also help organizations develop more effective security policies and training programs, ensuring that employees and systems are better equipped to defend against attacks. In addition to traditional penetration testing, some organizations are beginning to adopt bug bounty programs, where ethical hackers are rewarded for finding and reporting vulnerabilities. Port scanning plays a crucial role in these programs, as it allows participants to identify open ports and services on target systems. By leveraging the collective expertise of the hacking community, organizations can uncover vulnerabilities that might have otherwise gone unnoticed, strengthening their defenses and improving their overall security posture. Automated port scanning tools have been a key development in the history of port scanning, allowing security professionals to scan networks more efficiently and thoroughly. These tools have evolved over the years, becoming more advanced and capable of performing complex scans across large networks and diverse infrastructures. Today, automated port scanning tools are essential for identifying security weaknesses, mapping out network topologies, and assessing vulnerabilities in real time. The first port scanning tools were relatively simple programs that could identify open ports on a target system by sending connection requests and analyzing responses. These early tools, such as SuperScan and Nmap, relied on basic techniques like TCP connect scanning, which established full connections to open ports in order to determine if they were accessible. While effective, these early tools were limited in scope and often time-consuming, especially when scanning large networks. As the internet grew and networks became more complex, the need for more advanced automated port scanning tools became apparent. Nmap, developed in the late 1990s by Gordon Leon Fyodor, emerged as one of the most popular and widely used port scanning tools. Nmap introduced a variety of scanning techniques, including SYN scanning, UDP scanning, and OS fingerprinting, which allowed it to perform faster and more accurate scans. Nmap's ability to identify open ports, services, and operating systems made it an invaluable tool for network administrators and security professionals alike. In the years following the release of Nmap, several other automated port scanning tools were developed to address different needs in the cybersecurity industry. Tools like Masscan, OpenVAS, and ZMAP were introduced to handle large-scale scans and improve the speed and accuracy of port scanning across vast networks. Masscan, in particular, became known for its ability to scan the entire IPv4 address space in a matter of minutes. making it a powerful tool for identifying open ports across the global internet. Automated port scanning tools are also benefiting from the integration of cloud-based infrastructure and distributed scanning techniques. Cloud services allow port scanning tools to scale their operations and perform simultaneous scans from multiple locations around the world. This distributed approach improves the efficiency of scans and allows security professionals to cover larger attack surfaces. As automated port scanning tools have evolved, they have also become more user-friendly and accessible. Many tools now feature graphical user interfaces, GUIs, and integrated reporting capabilities, making it easier for even non-technical users to conduct port scans and interpret the results. This democratization of port scanning technology has helped to make cybersecurity more accessible to a broader audience, allowing organizations of all sizes to conduct regular scans and protect their networks. Port scanning is a critical element of cybersecurity threat intelligence, a discipline focused on collecting, analyzing, and disseminating data related to potential cyber threats. By conducting port scans, security professionals can gather valuable intelligence on the attack surface of their networks and identify potential vulnerabilities that might be targeted by cybercriminals or nation-state actors. This proactive approach allows organizations to better understand the threats they face and take preventive measures to protect their assets. One of the most significant contributions of port scanning to threat intelligence is its ability to reveal open ports and services that are accessible from the internet. Attackers often scan large portions of the internet to identify vulnerable targets that may have weak or misconfigured services running on open ports. By performing regular port scans on their own networks, security teams can mirror this behavior, identifying their own open ports and evaluating whether they present an opportunity for exploitation. In threat intelligence, information gained from port scanning is used to generate indicator of compromise (IOC) data, which can be shared within the cybersecurity community to alert others to emerging threats. For example, if a security researcher discovers a new vulnerability in a widely used service that is accessible via a certain port, this information can be shared with others, prompting them to scan for open ports associated with that service and patch any exposed systems. Port scans provide an easy way to gather this IOC data and enhance the collective knowledge of the security community, improving overall defense strategies. Port scanning is also useful in the context of attribution, the process of identifying the actor responsible for a cyber attack. By analyzing the techniques, tactics, and procedures, TTPs, used by attackers, security professionals can correlate the patterns of port scans with known attack groups or individual hackers. For example, if a particular scanning technique is associated with a specific group or type of attack, this information can help investigators trace the origin of the attack and determine its purpose. This level of insight into cyber attacks is vital for understanding adversaries' motivations and predicting future actions. In addition to providing data for threat intelligence reports, port scanning can also be used as part of a broader cyber threat hunting strategy. Threat hunting involves actively searching for signs of malicious activity within a network, rather than waiting for alerts from traditional security tools like intrusion detection systems, IDS, or firewalls. By performing regular port scans, cybersecurity teams can identify previously undetected vulnerabilities in suspicious services that may be indicative of an active attack or a system compromise. Port scanning, when combined with other threat hunting techniques, becomes a powerful tool for uncovering hidden threats that might otherwise go unnoticed. The evolving landscape of advanced persistent threats, APTs, long-term, targeted attacks, has made threat intelligence even more essential. Apt actors often use port scanning as an initial reconnaissance step to find vulnerable entry points into a network. By monitoring the scanning patterns of known threat actors, security teams can quickly identify and respond to emerging attacks. This real-time threat intelligence allows organizations to adapt their security posture to defend against ever-evolving attack strategies. Threat intelligence has become an indispensable part of modern cybersecurity. By leveraging port scanning techniques alongside other intelligence gathering methods, security teams can stay ahead of emerging threats and build more resilient networks. The shared knowledge obtained through port scans and threat intelligence reports helps protect organizations from increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks. While port scanning is an invaluable tool for cybersecurity professionals, it also raises important ethical and legal questions. As a non-intrusive method of gathering information about a system or network, port scanning is often perceived as a benign activity. However, its potential for misuse makes it a sensitive issue in the realm of cybersecurity. Ethical hackers and penetration testers must carefully navigate these concerns to ensure that their actions remain within legal and ethical boundaries. One of the primary ethical considerations surrounding port scanning is the consent of the target. In ethical hacking and penetration testing, the individual or organization conducting the scan must have explicit permission from the owner of the network or system being scanned. Without this consent, port scanning can be considered illegal, especially if it is performed with malicious intent. Unauthorized port scanning is sometimes viewed as a form of reconnaissance, which may be the first step toward launching a cyber attack. For this reason, many countries have strict laws governing unauthorized scanning activities. In the United States, for example, unauthorized port scanning can fall under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFAA, which prohibits any activity that involves unauthorized access to computer systems. This includes accessing or scanning ports without the owner's permission. Similarly, in many European countries, the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, and other data protection laws also impose restrictions on activities like unauthorized scanning, particularly when it comes to personal data or sensitive information. These legal frameworks have made it clear that port scanning, while useful in cybersecurity practices, must be carried out responsibly and with respect for privacy laws. Ethically, port scanning should be performed with the goal of improving security rather than exploiting vulnerabilities. This is a core principle of ethical hacking, the idea that hacking should be done to help organizations secure their systems rather than to cause harm. When ethical hackers conduct port scans, their goal is to identify potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by attackers and to report those findings to the organization to help them patch the weaknesses. The scanning process should be transparent, and the ethical hacker should always ensure that the organization is fully aware of the testing taking place. Penetration testers, in particular, must navigate these ethical and legal concerns when conducting port scans as part of a broader security assessment. Many penetration testing agreements include specific clauses that outline the scope of the engagement, the methods that will be used, and the boundaries within which the testers are authorized to operate. This ensures that the testers' actions remain within the bounds of the law and are ethically sound. On the other hand, there are instances where port scanning can be performed without malicious intent but still cause disruption. For example, large-scale or aggressive port scanning activities can overwhelm a network's resources and potentially lead to downtime or degraded performance. Even if the scanning is done with good intentions, it can have unintended consequences for the target system. For this reason, ethical hackers must be mindful of the potential impact of their scans and ensure that they do not inadvertently cause harm. As the world of cybersecurity continues to evolve, the ethical and legal implications of port scanning will remain an important consideration. Cybersecurity professionals must be educated on the appropriate legal frameworks and best practices to ensure that they conduct port scans responsibly and within the bounds of the law. This concludes the history of port scanning. Thank you for watching Mysterious Nuggets. Please like and subscribe.